Imagine this, a night so dark that even the moon hid behind the clouds. The rain poured without mercy, drenching the earth like it was trying to wash away something unholy. In the heart of the Old South, on a plantation cursed by cruelty, a frail 73-year-old slave was left to die in that storm. But the night didn't end the way anyone expected, because what emerged from that storm wasn't just thunder. It was vengeance, wrapped in something beyond human. The night was one that the earth itself seemed to mourn. Thick, black clouds stretched across the sky, swallowing the stars and silencing the light of the moon. The air was heavy, swollen with the promise of a storm that would not cleanse but condemn. On the outskirts of a sprawling plantation deep in the soaked red soil of Georgia stood a figure bent by time and toil. Elijah, a 73-year-old slave whose back bore the map of every lash he had endured, stood in the rain with nothing but rags clinging to his frail frame. His overseer had ordered him out into the fields to learn a lesson for faltering during the day's labor. The overseer's voice, rough and cold, had vanished into the distance hours ago, leaving Elijah alone beneath the bruised sky. The wind wailed through the trees like spirits lamenting the fate of the forgotten. Every drop of rain that struck Elijah's skin carried the sting of a whip, and yet he did not move. His legs trembled, not just from age, but from the memory of pain that refused to die. The mud beneath him sucked at his feet like the hands of the dead, pulling him back toward the ground that had taken so many before him. He could barely see the plantation house in the distance, a faint shadow glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, laughter and warmth thrived. Outside, an old man waited to die. But Elijah had seen too much in his long years of servitude to call this suffering new. He had seen children taken from mothers, men dragged to the whipping post, women vanish into the overseer's cabin under the cover of night. He had buried brothers and friends, whispered prayers over unmarked graves, and watched the overseer spit on their memories. His heart was a chamber of ghosts, and that night, as the rain grew heavier, it felt as if those ghosts were stirring again. Thunder rolled over the hills like an army marching through the heavens. The fields glistened with silver reflections of lightning. Each flash illuminated the empty rows of cotton, and for an instant, Elijah thought he saw figures moving among them, shapes that swayed not with the wind, but with purpose. He blinked the rain from his eyes, but they were gone, leaving only the whisper of the storm and the creak of the overseer's whip dangling from a fence post. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body shaking as if trying to release something trapped deep inside him. He remembered his mother's words, long before the plantations, long before his hair turned white. She had told him that storms carried messages, that when the heavens wept and the earth trembled, it was not simply weather, it was the ancestors speaking. They cried when injustice reached the heavens, when cruelty became too thick for the living to bear alone. As lightning split the sky again, Elijah whispered her words under his breath. He prayed not for life, but for release. He prayed that the land would remember him, that the wind would carry his name. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the quarters, muffled by the rain. It was a sound that usually meant the end of a workday, but tonight it rang hollow, like a funeral toll. The fields stretched endlessly before him, but Elijah felt them closing in, the shadows thickening, the air growing colder. He looked up at the storm, his lips trembling as he whispered into the darkness, asking why his suffering had to last so long. The rain answered with fury. It fell harder, soaking him to the bone, running down his face like tears not his own. The overseer's house door slammed open in the distance. Through the curtain of rain, Elijah saw a figure step out with a lantern, checking the grounds before retreating inside. The overseer's voice barked something harsh, though the storm drowned out his words. Then the door closed again, leaving Elijah alone once more. He tried to move, to take a single step toward shelter, but his legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the mud, his hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. The smell of soil, blood, and decay filled his nostrils. He knew this smell well. It was the scent of the grave. Lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat, Elijah thought he saw faces in the storm. Not human faces, but something older, something carved from pain itself. They flickered in and out of existence, shimmering through the rain like reflections on shattered glass. He tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the wind. His heart pounded like the drums he once heard in secret ceremonies long ago, before those traditions were beaten from him. Somewhere deep inside him, a rhythm began to stir, slow and steady, pulsing with the storm. The thunder grew closer, echoing through his chest. It felt alive, like a voice calling his name. The lightning struck a tree near the edge of the field, splitting it in two with a blinding flash. The sound reverberated across the land, and Elijah's body shuddered. He could feel something moving beneath the earth, something shifting as though the soil itself had woken from slumber. His fingers clenched around the mud, and a strange warmth spread through his hands, pulsing like blood. He lifted his gaze toward the heavens. His lips moved, whispering prayers that were older than any book, older than the country that enslaved him. The rain poured harder still, soaking him completely, but he no longer felt the cold. The world around him seemed to blur. He could hear whispers now, faint but growing louder, speaking in tongues he hadn't heard since childhood. The air thickened, vibrating with energy, and Elijah's vision darkened around the edges. Somewhere, in that pitch-black night, the storm began to answer him. He was no longer just a man abandoned to die in the rain. Something unseen stirred around him, something that had waited, silent, beneath the weight of centuries. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and iron. The earth groaned beneath him, as though it had finally remembered every drop of blood it had swallowed. The lightning illuminated his face again, and though he was weak and broken, his eyes glowed with something fierce and unearthly, a flicker of life that no overseer's cruelty could extinguish. The land was never innocent, not even before the plantation rose from its soil, long before the overseer's whip cut through the air, long before Elijah's blood mixed with the mud. The ground already carried whispers of something restless. The natives who once walked those woods spoke of a spirit that slept beneath the earth, an entity born of betrayal and death. When the first men came with chains and axes, clearing trees to build their grand manor, they awoke what should have been left alone. Every tree felled was a wound. Every scream, every lash, every tear became an offering to the soil, feeding a hunger that grew stronger with each injustice buried within it. The plantation was built not just on land, but on memory, on pain that refused to die. As years passed, people stopped speaking of curses, though they never truly forgot. They turned their backs to the strange things they saw in the fog, the faint shapes moving between the fields, the feeling of being watched even under the brightest sun. The masters called it superstition. The slaves called it the land remembering. They knew that the soil beneath their bare feet was alive, heavy with something that listened. And on nights when thunder rolled across the horizon, when the clouds turned the sky black, they could feel it stir. The overseer, a man who prided himself on cruelty, knew only control. He didn't believe in spirits or curses. He believed in fear, in power, in the breaking of bodies and wills. To him, the land was property, and the people upon it were tools. Yet even he felt something shift when he walked those fields at night. Sometimes his lantern flickered without cause, or he'd hear the faint sound of chains rattling though none were near. He'd spit into the mud and mutter about ghosts, but deep down, something cold lingered in his chest each time the wind carried a voice that wasn't his. The slaves whispered that the plantation had a heart, a dark, beating heart buried deep beneath the fields. It throbbed with every lash, every scream, every broken soul that fell to the ground. The more blood it drank, the stronger it grew. Some said that it was the spirit of the land itself, twisted by the weight of cruelty, transformed into something vengeful. Others believed it was a spirit older than man, a shadow that fed on human sin, waiting for the day it would rise. Whatever it was, they all agreed on one thing: it listened. Elijah knew this better than anyone. He had lived long enough to see the land change, to watch the crops grow taller but the shadows grow thicker. He'd seen fog roll in from nowhere and linger for hours, seen strange shapes in the cornrows that moved even when the wind stood still. He knew the stories, but he also knew the truth. The plantation didn't belong to the overseer or the master. It belonged to the dead. Each grave dug behind the quarters, each unmarked mound of dirt, was a doorway. The old folks would say that the land was filling with spirits too restless to leave, bound by pain and longing. There were nights when the slaves would gather in secret, deep within the woods, far from the eyes of their captors. They'd hum low songs that were not for the living. The rhythm carried through the trees, soft and haunting, blending with the sounds of insects and the sigh of the wind. They believed the songs reached the dead, calming them, keeping the restless spirits from spilling into the world of the living. But some nights, when the overseer punished too many, or when blood soaked the earth too deep, the songs changed. The air would thicken and the ground would pulse like a living thing. That was when they knew the land had begun to stir again. On the night Elijah was left in the rain, that pulse returned stronger than ever. The clouds hung low, pressing against the fields like a suffocating shroud. The air was dense, filled with the smell of damp soil and decay. The storm didn't feel natural. It felt summoned, as if something had finally answered the cries buried in the dirt. The thunder wasn't just thunder anymore. It was a voice. Each rumble carried the sound of chains dragging, of wood creaking under weight unseen. The rain fell harder, soaking through the earth, seeping into graves that had long been forgotten. Beneath the plantation, deep where no shovel had ever reached, the soil moved. Worms and roots twisted violently as something ancient stretched awake. The cries of generations mingled into a low hum, a vibration that rose through the mud and roots, trembling through the foundations of the plantation house itself. The overseer, sitting by the fire with his whiskey, paused when he felt it. A faint shake beneath his boots, so subtle he thought he imagined it. But the dogs outside began to howl, their cries piercing through the roar of the storm. In the quarters, the remaining slaves felt it too. Some fell to their knees, clutching their chests as if their hearts were being squeezed by unseen hands. Others began to weep quietly, knowing what was coming. The elders whispered that the land had remembered, that the blood spilled over centuries had reached its limit. And out there, in the middle of the storm, Elijah was the final spark. His suffering, his abandonment, was the final act that broke the silence. Lightning carved across the sky, illuminating the fields in ghostly white. The rain poured like 1,000 hands striking the earth. Somewhere in that chaos, a sound began, a faint rhythmic pulse beneath the thunder, steady and growing louder. The wind carried voices, thousands of them, whispering through the trees, speaking the names of the dead. The overseer heard them too, though he would never admit it. He stood at his window, peering out into the blackness, the storm reflecting in his eyes. He could see nothing but the faint silhouette of the old man still kneeling in the rain. But there was something else now, something behind him, a shadow that seemed to rise with every flash of lightning. The land that had borne so much cruelty was no longer silent. The curse that had been buried for generations began to breathe again, feeding on the storm, feeding on pain. The overseer's punishment had not gone unnoticed. The plantation's dark secret, whispered for years and ignored by those who profited from its misery, was awake once more. And it was listening. The rain had reached a fevered pitch, a relentless torrent that seemed intent on drowning the sins of the world. The sky tore open with every bolt of lightning, painting the fields in blinding white for the briefest of moments before plunging them back into blackness. Each flash revealed a glimpse of something moving among the rows, shadows that did not belong to the living. Elijah's frail body trembled as he knelt in the mud, his soaked rags clinging to his bones, his breath ragged and shallow. But the storm around him was no longer just weather. The air pulsed, alive with a strange rhythm, and it felt as though the world itself was breathing with him. The ground beneath his hands quivered, small vibrations running through the earth like veins filled with life. From the depths of the storm came a low hum, a sound that did not come from the wind or the thunder but from the soil itself. It grew in intensity, spreading outward through the fields like ripples in dark water. The overseer, sitting safe and dry in his quarters, looked up from his bottle as the candles flickered. A sudden draught blew through the cracks in the walls, cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of iron and decay. He grumbled under his breath, thinking it was the storm pressing against the old wood. But the sound persisted, a deep, rhythmic beat, steady and measured, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Out in the fields, Elijah lifted his head. His eyes, clouded by age, caught the faintest flicker of movement between the lightning strikes. The rows of cotton swayed unnaturally, their white buds glowing faintly under the storm's fury. Shapes began to form between the stalks, shadows that moved with purpose, not blown by the wind but walking, gliding, twisting. His lips parted as the rain washed over his face, and for a moment he thought he heard voices rising from the soil. They were not screams or moans, but chants, low and steady, echoing the old rhythms he'd heard as a child when his people would sing to the night. The sound filled the air, blending with the thunder until it became impossible to tell where nature ended and something else began. The overseer stepped outside, his lantern trembling in his hand. The flames sputtered violently, struggling to stay alive against the wind. He squinted into the darkness, his boots sinking into the mud. The air felt thick, heavy, almost alive. It pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The fields stretched endlessly before him, the rain reducing everything to shadow and movement. Then he saw it, a flicker of something standing upright in the distance, far taller than any man, unmoving despite the wind. He blinked hard, but when lightning split the sky again, it was gone. The overseer's heart began to pound, though he would not admit fear. He turned to head back inside, but the ground trembled beneath his feet, a low rumble that rolled across the fields like distant thunder from beneath the surface. Elijah felt that tremor too. He pressed his palms into the mud and felt warmth spreading through the ground, faint but unmistakable, as if the soil had begun to bleed heat. The rain hissed where it met the warmth, sending up thin wisps of steam that curled around him. The voices grew louder now, whispering words he could not fully understand but somehow knew. It was a language older than chains, older than pain. His heart pounded, his frail chest rising and falling in rhythm with the storm. The wind began to circle him, slow at first, then faster, forming a spiral of rain and dirt that lifted from the ground. The overseer, now pacing his porch, felt the hair on his arms rise. The storm had changed. It no longer sounded like a storm at all. The thunder came in patterns, almost deliberate, like a drumbeat marking a ceremony. He shouted toward the fields, his voice barely carrying over the rain. No one answered. The dogs barked furiously from their posts, then fell silent all at once, their howls cut short as though something had stolen the sound from the air. He froze, listening. In that silence he could hear something else. Footsteps, slow and heavy, trudging through the mud. Lightning illuminated the horizon again, and for a fraction of a second, the overseer saw them. Dozens of figures walking through the storm, their outlines distorted by rain but unmistakably human. Their clothes hung in tatters, their faces hidden by shadows, yet he could feel their eyes upon him. They moved in unison, silent and deliberate, toward the place where Elijah knelt. The overseer shouted again, but his voice was lost to the wind. He stumbled backward, his lantern slipping from his hand and shattering against the porch. The flame sputtered and died, leaving him in darkness. Out in the field, Elijah felt the ground rise and fall as though something massive was breathing beneath him. He could no longer tell where the storm ended and he began. The rain formed rivers that swirled around him, shaping patterns in the mud, circles within circles, symbols that glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. The warmth beneath his hands turned to heat, and from deep below a crack sounded like the splitting of stone. He looked up, and there, at the edge of the storm's heart, a form began to emerge. It was not man, not beast, but something born of both earth and sky. The air warped around it, bending the rain, swallowing sound. Its shape flickered in and out of existence, one moment smoke, the next shadow, the next light. The overseer fell to his knees, his breath catching in his throat. His mind struggled to make sense of what he saw. The figure rose higher, stretching its limbs as though testing its own existence. Lightning flashed again, and in that light he thought he saw faces within it. Faces of men and women, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent cries. They twisted together, forming a single massive silhouette that towered over the field. The wind screamed as the storm gathered around it, and for the first time the overseer felt true fear claw at his chest. Elijah stared upward, his frail body trembling as the rain beat down on him. The whispers had stopped. The hum had faded. There was only silence now, and in that silence the figure leaned toward him. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of wet earth and iron. Elijah's lips moved, though no sound came out. His eyes reflected the light of the storm as the shape before him began to move, shifting, breathing, becoming. The storm had given birth to something that was neither ghost nor man, something that had crawled out of the grave of history itself, shaped by every cruelty buried beneath that cursed plantation. The overseer stumbled backward as the storm seemed to come alive around him, the wind twisting and shrieking like a living thing. His lantern was gone, shattered in the mud, its brief light extinguished, leaving him swallowed in darkness. Each flash of lightning revealed a glimpse of the field below, shadows moving, soil shifting, the outline of the old slave still kneeling in the rain. But there was something else now, something that stretched behind Elijah, tall and shapeless, bending the storm to its will. The overseer's heart pounded against his ribs as he clutched the post of the porch, trying to steady himself. His mind told him it was the weather, just a trick of light, but his body felt otherwise. His skin prickled, as if thousands of unseen eyes had turned toward him at once. The storm carried whispers, voices layered over one another, chanting in tongues that no man on the plantation had ever spoken aloud. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, a deep vibration that rattled the windows of the big house. Inside, the servants huddled together, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. The master slept upstairs, unaware or unwilling to rise, but the overseer could not look away. The air shimmered with heat, though the rain was cold. Each gust of wind brought with it a foul scent, something like burnt copper and soil overturned from graves. He turned his gaze back toward Elijah, but the old man was no longer alone. The shadows had gathered around him, rising out of the earth like smoke given shape. They swayed, their forms shifting, bending, joining one another in a slow, rhythmic motion that moved with the thunder's pulse. The overseer took a step forward, squinting through the downpour. The sight made his stomach twist. The shapes were not formless mist, as he had thought. They were figures, dozens of them, men and women with broken backs, scarred faces, and hollow eyes glowing faintly in the stormlight. The realization clawed through him, icy and immediate. He knew those faces. Some he had whipped himself, some he had ordered to be beaten, some had died in the fields where they now stood, their bodies dumped into shallow graves and forgotten. They stared at him through the sheets of rain, silent but seething with the weight of 1,000 unspoken screams. The overseer stumbled down the steps, his boots sinking deep into the mud. He tried to speak, to demand who was there, but his voice cracked before it reached his lips. Lightning split the sky once more, and in that instant he saw the impossible. Their feet did not touch the ground. The figures hovered just above the earth, swaying in unison, as though tethered to the storm itself. He turned to run, but the storm fought him. The wind tore at his clothes, the rain struck his skin like shards of glass, and each step forward felt like pushing against an unseen wall. The voices rose now, no longer whispers but cries, growing louder, rising from the soil and sky in equal measure. It was as if the entire world was crying out against him, a chorus of pain and retribution. His heart thudded painfully, and he could no longer hear his own breathing over the storm's fury. The lightning struck again, closer this time, illuminating the field in white fire. Elijah was standing now. The frail old man who should have been broken was upright, his head lifted toward the sky, his eyes wide and shining with something not entirely human. His body shook, but not with fear. It was as if something had filled him, something vast and ancient. The overseer called his name, desperate, his voice barely audible over the thunder. The old man did not answer. The figures around him turned their faces toward the overseer, and the air seemed to freeze. Their eyes burned brighter, reflecting the lightning, hollow and endless. The overseer felt his knees weaken beneath him as they began to move, not running, not walking, but gliding across the mud toward him. Their movement was silent, smooth, their shapes flickering like candlelight. He stumbled backward, his hands groping for the whip at his belt. It was an instinct, not a choice, the reflex of a man who knew only control. He cracked it into the air, the sound sharp and defiant against the storm. The lash cut through the rain, but met nothing. The figures did not flinch, did not slow. The whip split again, the sound swallowed by thunder, and he screamed, the panic breaking through his composure. Elijah began to move too, his slow steps deliberate, each one sending a ripple through the water pooling beneath him. The overseer felt the air grow heavier with each pace, pressing down on him until his chest ached. He shouted again, but his words came out as broken gasps. The storm roared back, louder than before, drowning his voice in a surge of wind. The earth beneath him shook violently, and he lost his balance, crashing to his knees in the mud. His hands sank into the wet soil, and when he tried to pull them free, something caught him, thin, wiry tendrils curling around his wrists. He looked down and saw roots twisting up from the ground, black and slick, wrapping around his arms with impossible strength. He yanked, but they held fast, tightening as if alive. The shadows reached him then. They surrounded him in a circle, their faces hidden, their eyes gleaming faintly through the rain. The overseer's breath came in short, terrified bursts. He screamed for help, for mercy, for anyone who could hear him, but the storm devoured every sound he made. The first hand touched his shoulder, cold and wet as the grave, then another and another, until he was engulfed by them. The figures leaned closer, whispering in voices that were not one but many, merging into a single unearthly sound. The overseer tried to pray, but even the words refused to come. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, into his bones, his body trembling violently as the whispers grew louder. The lightning struck again, and in that instant, he saw their faces clearly. They were not only the dead he had known, they were the dead he had made. Every soul that had fallen under his cruelty, every life extinguished by his command, stared back at him. Their mouths opened as one, and the air filled with a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. It was not a scream nor a moan, but something deeper, a sound that carried centuries of pain, anger, and sorrow. It rolled over him, through him, shaking the ground, shaking the sky. He clawed at the mud, but the roots held tighter, pulling him down inch by inch as the circle closed in. His vision blurred, rain and tears mixing until he could no longer tell them apart. The faces above him grew closer, merging into a single mass of shadow and light. The storm howled, and the overseer felt the weight of every cruelty he had ever inflicted pressing down upon him, dragging him into the same earth that had swallowed all those before him. By dawn, the storm had quieted, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the birds dared not sing. The plantation lay drenched beneath a pale, washed-out sky, its fields glistening with puddles that reflected the grey light like broken mirrors. The air was thick and unmoving, heavy with the scent of rain, earth, and something else, something metallic, sharp, and faintly bitter. The overseer's house stood crooked, its porch half collapsed, one shutter torn loose and banging softly against the wall with each lazy breath of wind. The servants who emerged from the quarters moved slowly, their eyes wide, their faces drawn tight with unease. No one spoke. They knew before they saw. They could feel it in the stillness, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath. The fields were no longer the same. The once neat rows of cotton had been torn apart by the storm, their white blooms now scattered like bones across the mud. Deep cracks marred the soil, as though the land itself had split open in anger. The air shimmered faintly, and the scent of ozone lingered, unnatural and electric. Some of the older workers refused to step beyond the fences, whispering prayers under their breath, tracing symbols into the air. They said the storm had left something behind, something that had not been there before. When they finally found the overseer, it was near the edge of the field where Elijah had last been seen. He was lying half buried in the mud, his body twisted, his face turned toward the sky. His eyes were open but empty, his mouth frozen in an expression that none could describe. Around him, the earth was scorched in a perfect circle, as if lightning had struck, though there was no sign of burning beyond that mark. The roots around him were blackened and curled, reaching out from the soil like claws. The men who carried his body back to the house said that the ground beneath him was warm, even hours after the rain had stopped. They said that when they lifted him, they heard a faint sound, like a sigh from beneath the earth, as if something living had been disturbed. Elijah was never found. The storm had taken him, or so they said. Some claimed they saw his figure still standing in the rain long after the thunder had faded, motionless, staring toward the overseer's house. Others swore they heard his voice in the wind, whispering through the cracks in the cabin walls. His absence became a story told in hushed tones, one that grew stranger with each passing season. Some said he had been taken by the spirits of the land, others that he had become one of them. A few believed he had finally been freed, that the storm had carried his soul into the next world, but even those who said it did not truly believe. There was no peace in the air that followed, only unease. Weeks passed, and the plantation began to wither. The crops, once proud and thick, turned grey at the edges, their leaves curling as if scorched by unseen fire. The animals refused to enter the fields, their eyes rolling white when driven too close. The soil, once rich and dark, grew pale and brittle, as though drained of its life. Strange symbols began to appear on the walls of the overseer's quarters, long, jagged markings that no one could explain. At first, they thought it was vandalism, the work of angry hands, but the shapes were too intricate, too deliberate. They appeared overnight, carved deep into the wood, and no one ever saw who made them. The markings spread, appearing on fences, on trees, even on the ground itself. Each morning brought new ones, each stranger than the last. At night, the air changed. The wind no longer came from the west as it once did. It circled instead, swirling around the fields, carrying whispers that had no source. The workers in the cabins would wake to the sound of footsteps outside, slow and heavy, dragging through the wet earth. When they peered through the cracks in the shutters, they sometimes saw a figure standing in the distance. Tall, stooped, motionless. Its outline blurred by the mist, but its posture unmistakable. An old man, with shoulders bent and head bowed. When lightning flashed, it vanished, leaving only the sway of the trees and the sound of the wind sighing through the cotton stalks. The master of the plantation, fearful of what he called superstition, ordered the quarters to be cleaned, the fields replanted, and the markings scrubbed away. But no matter how many men he sent, the symbols returned. The more they tried to erase them, the deeper they seemed to appear. One morning he found them carved into his own doorframe, deep enough to splinter the wood. He ordered a priest to bless the land, but the priest left before sundown, pale-faced and trembling, muttering about things that should never be disturbed. Soon after, the plantation's workers began to disappear. One by one, they vanished without a sound, their beds left empty, their tools still in place. No one saw them leave, and no tracks marked their path. Those who remained spoke of the nights growing longer, of the air growing colder even when the sun shone. Some swore they saw shadows moving through the fields at dusk, bending the cotton as they passed. Others heard the distant crack of a whip, followed by a man's cry, echoing faintly through the hills, though no overseer remained to wield it. By the time autumn came, the plantation was half abandoned. The few who stayed did so out of desperation, too poor or too frightened to leave. They whispered of Elijah's spirit wandering the grounds, neither vengeful nor at rest. They said he walked through the rain when the sky turned black, his figure glowing faintly like mist, his steps soundless on the soaked earth. Wherever he passed, the air grew cold and the night filled with whispers. Some claimed he was not alone, that behind him walked the shapes of those long dead, their eyes like dim lanterns in the dark. They moved in silence, crossing the fields that had once held their chains, their presence marked only by the bending of grass and the faint rustle of unseen feet. The plantation fell into ruin within a year. The fields yielded nothing. The house stood hollow, its windows broken, its doors hanging open to the wind. Travelers who passed by spoke of strange lights glowing over the fields at night, soft and pulsing, like embers floating above the ground. Some said they heard singing, low, mournful and ancient, carried on the breeze. Others said they saw the old man himself, standing at the edge of the property, watching the road with empty eyes, as if waiting for someone or something that had yet to come. The world moved on. The years blurred together, but the land remained marked, and those who dared to walk it still felt the weight of eyes upon them when the rain began to fall.